June 17, 1944. The island of Saipan burned beneath a sky split by American flares. In the darkness of a cave, a young naval nurse named Aiko pressed her back to the damp stone wall. She was 20 years old, her hands still stained with iodine and gunpowder smoke. She had been taught that capture was worse than death, that American soldiers would strip her of dignity, torture her, reduce her to nothing. That was what the officers said, what the leaflets warned, what Bushido demanded she believe. But the moment she stumbled into captivity, something shifted. Instead of jeers or blows, she saw order American medics moving with calm efficiency guards, speaking firmly but without cruelty. Then came the moment that would brand itself forever into her memory. A door creaked open. Steam rolled out in heavy clouds, carrying a scent. Alien and impossible in war, the sharp, clean fragrance of soap. Aiko froze. Hot water hissed from metal pipes overhead, cascading in steady streams. She stared uncomprehending. In Japan, she had once bathed in wooden tubs heated by fire. Here, in the custody of her enemy, water poured endlessly from the ceiling itself. One of the nurses gestured, gently pointing her toward the shower, offering a towel thick as winter blankets. Aiko's breath caught. Could this be a trick? Or had everything she had been told been a lie? The steam curled around her like a question she could not answer. The journey to captivity began with chains of silence more than with iron. After surrendering on Saipan, the surviving female auxiliaries and nurses were gathered into groups under the careful watch of American Marines. Their uniforms were ragged, their faces hollow from weeks of bombardment and hunger. The Japanese had warned them that to fall into enemy hands was to step into hell. Every step toward the waiting trucks felt like walking into the mouth of that prophecy. Aiko gripped the sleeve of her companion, bracing herself for blows that never came. Instead, the Americans waved them forward with curt gestures, loading them into transport vehicles as though they were fragile rather than dangerous. The trucks rattled down to the shore where ships loomed in the mist. Some of the women expected cages, others expected humiliation before the jeering enemy. What awaited instead was the orderly, methodical processing of captives. On the deck of a transport vessel bound for Hawaii, they were lined up and given numbers. Their wounds were cleaned, bandages replaced. Aiko felt the sting of antiseptic on her arm and flinched, expecting cruelty in the nurse's touch. But the American medic only murmured something soft, wrapping her arm with practiced care. It unsettled her more than pain would have. The voyage lasted days. The ocean was vast, the horizon endless, and the sound of the engines lulled the women into uneasy sleep. At night, the prisoners whispered to one another. "They're fattening us for some experiment," one hissed. Another swore that the soap and bandages were poison. Aiko said nothing, but the scent of the gauze on her arm, clean, sterile, unlike anything she had known in the caves, lingered in her mind. When they finally glimpsed the green slopes of Oahu rising from the sea, the prisoners braced themselves for the true torment to begin. They were marched down the gangplank into a sunlit port, the American flag snapping in the wind. The air smelled of salt and flowers, a sharp contrast to the sulphur stench of battlefields. Instead of cages, they were herded toward waiting buses, and instead of shouts, there was paperwork, names written carefully, temperatures taken, wounds logged. The intake process at the camp was almost disorienting in its precision. Each woman surrendered her personal belongings, pocket knives, keepsakes, even combs. They were given small metal tags stamped with numbers. Aiko studied hers, the digits pressed into cool steel, a strange replacement for her lost identity. Then came the unexpected, a folded blanket, a thin pillow, and in her hand a bar of soap wrapped in wax paper. She turned it over, reading the unfamiliar English letters stamped into its surface. The smell was sharp and clean, a world away from the smoke and sweat she carried from Saipan. Next came the moment they all dreaded, the showers. They were lined up in a narrow corridor where steam drifted through half-open doors. Aiko's heart pounded. She remembered stories told by officers that Americans used showers to gas their captives, that humiliation would be their first punishment. The women clutched one another's arms, trembling. But when the doors opened, there was only tile floors, chrome pipes, and the rush of clear hot water. American attendants, both male guards and female nurses, stood aside, offering instructions in slow, careful words. Towels were stacked on a table, thick and freshly laundered. One by one, the women stepped inside. The water hit Aiko's shoulders, hot enough to sting at first, then to melt away the crust of dirt, sweat, and ash. She gasped, clutching the soap, rubbing its slick surface between her palms. The scent of lather filled her nose, cutting through weeks of battlefield filth. Tears pricked her eyes, not from sorrow but from the overwhelming sensation of being clean. She remembered her mother's wooden bathhouse back in Kyoto, the way steam curled through the rafters, how her little brothers would laugh and splash. That memory rose unbidden, triggered by an enemy's plumbing. When the showers ended, the women emerged, wrapped in towels, hair-dripping faces shining in bewildered disbelief. No whips, no mockery, no shame. Instead, they were directed to barracks lined with metal-framed beds, white sheets stretched tightly across mattresses, pillows plump and waiting. On each bed, a folded change of clothing lay neatly. The shock did not end there. As dusk settled, the smell of food wafted across the compound. The clang of ladles against pots, the murmur of voices in the mess hall, the unmistakable aroma of bread and coffee. Aiko's stomach clenched painfully. She had not smelled such richness in months. The guards led them to the dining hall where long tables waited. Plates were filled with portions so generous it seemed impossible. Slices of meat, potatoes, a roll of bread, steaming vegetables. Each prisoner received the same ration as the American guards. The women sat stiffly, eyes darting at one another. Was this real? Could they eat it without consequence? Aiko's hand trembled as she lifted the spoon. The first sip of hot stew spread warmth through her chest, a sensation so alien to her war-hollowed body that she nearly sobbed. Around her, some women refused to touch the food, muttering that it was bait. Others devoured it too hungry to resist. Later, lying in her bunk, Aiko stared at the ceiling. The hum of electric lights filled the silence. Her skin still carried the faint perfume of soap. Her stomach was full, her body swaddled in warmth. Yet her mind refused peace. Everything she had been taught clashed with the evidence of her senses. She was alive, unhurt, even comforted by enemies who were supposed to despise her. In the corner of the barracks, another prisoner whispered prayers to the ancestors, asking forgiveness. Aiko pressed the bar of soap, now tucked beneath her pillow, into her palm. Its smooth surface was real, tangible, undeniable. She did not know if this was mercy or manipulation, but it was powerful enough to make her doubt. That night she could not sleep. The sound of water pipes rushing faintly in the walls reminded her that beyond the fear and ideology there existed a different world. A world where even captives could shower in hot water and lay their heads on clean pillows. The contradiction gnawed at her heart more deeply than any lash ever could. Morning in the camp began not with gunfire or barking orders, but with the shrill ring of a brass bell. It startled Aiko the first time she heard it. She shot upright, expecting the chaos of shouted commands, perhaps punishment for oversleeping. Instead, the guards moved methodically through the barracks, clipboards in hand, counting heads with the precision of clerks in an office. Their voices were calm, almost businesslike. The prisoners were lined up for roll call, not whipped into formation. Aiko glanced down at the floorboards beneath her bare feet. They were swept clean, smelling faintly of disinfectant. Even that smell unsettled her. After roll call came the ritual of washing. Along one wall of the barracks stood a row of porcelain sinks, each with gleaming faucets. Mirrors hung above them. It was strange enough to see her own reflection, gaunt hair, cropped unevenly, eyes wide with exhaustion. Stranger still was the sight of soap resting in a dish beside every sink. The guards gestured for the women to wash their hands before breakfast. The order seemed almost absurd. Why would an enemy care whether prisoners carried dirt under their fingernails? Yet the Americans insisted. Aiko worked the bar of soap between her fingers, watching the white suds bloom. She rinsed them away, staring at the pale skin beneath. Her hands smelled sharp and clean. For the first time in years, they no longer reeked of iodine, sweat, and ash. Breakfast itself was another dissonance. The mess hall was cavernous, lined with long tables that echoed with the scrape of tin trays. American cooks ladled out portions as though the prisoners were ordinary soldiers, not enemies. On Aiko's tray appeared a scoop of oatmeal, a hard-boiled egg, and a mug of coffee so strong its scent filled the room. She sat stiffly, hands folded in her lap, until the hunger overcame her hesitation. The first bite of oatmeal, bland yet warm, seemed to sink directly into her bones. Around her the other women exchanged nervous glances. Some ate ravenously. Others poked suspiciously at their food. One whispered, "It tastes safe." Another muttered, "They want us weak. Don't trust it." The days unfolded with a rhythm both alien and soothing. After meals there were inspections, not brutal interrogations, but checks for hygiene. Guards walked the aisles, ensuring beds were made, blankets folded tightly, floors swept. Any mistake was corrected with instructions rather than blows. At first, the prisoners obeyed mechanically, waiting for the cruelty to reveal itself. But as days turned into weeks, Aiko began to sense a different pattern order, enforced not through terror, but through repetition rules, and most jarring of all, fairness. The barracks themselves resembled dormitories more than cages. Metal bunks stood in neat rows, each with a thin mattress, white sheets, and a pillow. At night, Aiko would lie awake, listening to the steady breathing of dozens of women around her. In the faint glow of electric lamps, she studied the ceiling beams and tried to reconcile the contradictions. She had expected filth, darkness, hunger. Instead, there was routine warmth and the curious hum of electric wires in the walls. Hygiene was treated almost as a sacred duty. Every prisoner received supplies, soap, a comb, toothbrush, toothpaste, and sanitary rations. Medical inspections were regular, led by army nurses, who examined wounds, treated infections, even checked teeth. When Aiko sat in a chair while a dentist examined her mouth, she thought for certain he would mock her. Instead, he simply cleaned her teeth with meticulous care, handing her a small mirror so she could see the result. The experience left her shaken. Why would the enemy bother? Evenings brought another layer of surreal routine. Some women were assigned light work, sewing uniforms, tending the vegetable garden within the fence, or helping in the laundry. Participation was technically voluntary, but the work provided extra rations, so many agreed. Aiko found herself folding crisp linens in the laundry room, the scent of detergent filling her lungs. Each piece of cloth reminded her of home, her mother folding futons in the small wooden house that no longer existed. That memory stung, yet the act of folding gave her hands something steady to do. Beyond chores, the camp offered diversions that felt unreal. English classes were held in a corner of the compound. Prisoners practiced simple phrases, "Thank you, please, good morning." Aiko repeated the words quietly, the syllables strange on her tongue. A library stocked with donated novels and magazines stood open, and some women flipped through pages of stories they could not fully read but nonetheless treasured for the images. Music crackled from a Radio American swing with its alien rhythms, filling the evenings with cheer that clashed brutally with memories of air raid sirens back home. Yet beneath the order, a tension gnawed constantly. Letters trickled in from Japan, smuggled through the Red Cross. They spoke of rice shortages, of firestorms that had reduced whole neighborhoods to ash, of children collapsing from malnutrition. Each word painted a picture more horrific than captivity itself. The contrast was unbearable. Behind the barbed wire, there was bread, soap, medicine, and warmth. Outside in the homeland, they still claimed loyalty to there was famine and ruin. Aiko's mind became a battlefield. At night, she pulled the blanket over her head and clutched her bar of soap. The scent clung to her skin, intoxicating and damning. Was this kindness real, or simply a carefully constructed deception? Could mercy itself be a weapon? She remembered the stern faces of her instructors who had warned that the Americans would break her spirit. Yet they had not used whips or fists. They had used hot showers, clean sheets, and full meals. The women whispered of traps. One scratched into her notebook in halting Cana bait of soap. Another scrawled across the margin, "Better to starve than to be fooled." But when the dinner bell rang and the smell of stew wafted through the air, even the skeptics faltered. Aiko watched them the same way she watched herself, torn between resistance and surrender to the simple, undeniable truth of survival. In the quiet moments, flashes of memory pierced her heart. The smell of clean linen reminded her of spring mornings in Kyoto. The warmth of coffee recalled her father's laughter long before he donned a uniform and vanished to the front. Each sensory detail felt like betrayal and yet like salvation. She lay awake, torn between shame and gratitude, convinced that her very heartbeat was being pulled in two directions. Camp life was not freedom. There were still fences, guards, and the weight of captivity. But within those fences existed a rhythm that undermined everything Aiko had been taught. She had expected hell. Instead, she found something far more dangerous to her beliefs, a quiet, relentless normalcy. And in that normalcy lay the seeds of doubt that no amount of propaganda could silence. The turning point arrived not with violence, but with something deceptively simple: a meal. Weeks had passed in the camp, weeks of hot showers and the ritual of soap that still unsettled Aiko, weeks of orderly barracks and clean sheets that made her doubt everything she had been taught. Yet it was food, not water, that finally cracked the armor of ideology. One morning the prisoners lined up in the mess hall as usual. The air shimmered with the steam of boiling pots, the clatter of ladles against metal pans. Aiko clutched her tray, heart pounding with the same confusion she had felt since arriving. When she reached the front of the line, the cook, a broad-shouldered American with sleeves rolled up and sweat on his brow, placed something unfamiliar on her tray: a thick slice of bread, toasted golden brown with a smear of a creamy tan, paste glistening under the lights. Beside it, a steaming mug of black coffee. Aiko stared. She recognized bread, though rarely had she eaten it in Japan, where rice was king. But the paste, what was it? She sniffed. The smell was earthy, nutty, strange. Her neighbor whispered the word in broken English: peanut butter. The syllables felt clumsy, alien. The prisoners, Saturday. The room was filled with hesitant silence. Aiko lifted the bread slowly, the peanut butter clinging like glue. She brought it to her lips, then froze. At that moment her mind split in two. One voice screamed, "This is the enemy's food. To eat it is to accept their mercy. To accept mercy is to betray everything you swore to defend." Another voice, quieter but stronger, whispered, "You are starving. You are alive. Survival is your duty too." She bit. The taste exploded across her tongue, thick, oily, sweet, and salty at once. It was unlike anything she had ever tasted. For an instant, the mess hall disappeared. She was a little girl again in her mother's kitchen in Kyoto, biting into a rice cake spread with sweet red bean paste. The peanut butter was nothing like anko, yet it triggered the same sensation: childhood safety, the warmth of being fed by a parent's hand. Aiko's chest tightened. Tears welled unexpectedly. She chewed slowly, each bite sticky, forcing her to swallow with gulps of the bitter coffee. The coffee itself was another assault on her senses, scalding, pungent, flooding her body with heat. She had tasted coffee only once before, years earlier, when her father had brought home a small tin as a curiosity. He had laughed, calling it the drink of the West. Now here she was, a prisoner, clutching the enemy's mug, drinking their strength. Around her, the other women reacted in ways just as fractured. One spat her bread back onto the tray, muttering that it was poison. Another devoured hers hungrily, then licked her fingers shamelessly. Some laughed nervously, whispering that perhaps this was a trick to soften them. Yet the room soon filled with the sounds of chewing, the scraping of spoons, the quiet sighs of satisfaction that no one dared name. For Aiko, the struggle did not end with the last bite. She stared at her empty tray, shame burning through her chest. Bushido had taught her to endure hunger, to embrace suffering as proof of loyalty. But the Americans had offered her something more dangerous than pain: comfort. Wasn't comfort a more seductive weapon? That evening, back in the barracks, the debate ignited. Some prisoners denounced the meal as psychological warfare. "They feed us to make us soft," one declared. "They want us to forget Japan." Others argued the opposite. "They feed us because we are human. Doesn't the Geneva Convention require it?" The words Geneva Convention hung heavy, foreign, almost absurd. Most had never heard of such a thing before captivity. Aiko listened silent as her companions argued. Beneath her pillow, the bar of soap still rested, its corners now worn smooth. She realized with a jolt that the soap and the peanut butter were twin symbols, both everyday objects, both ordinary to Americans, yet both instruments of profound disorientation. Cleanliness and nourishment, these were not weapons she had been trained to resist. And yet they were shattering her resolve more effectively than any whip or chain could. The next morning, when the cook ladled another smear of peanut butter onto her bread, Aiko hesitated again. She wanted to refuse to prove to herself she still belonged to her homeland, but her hands betrayed her, clutching the bread, bringing it to her mouth. The taste filled her again and again. Her heart ached with the memory of her mother's kitchen. The power of food is that it speaks in the language of the body, bypassing ideology. Hunger gnaws without mercy, and satisfaction soothes without permission. Every meal in the camp became a trial, a courtroom where her loyalty and her instincts argued bitterly. She knew she could not starve herself, not when her survival might one day mean returning home, perhaps even helping rebuild what was left of her country. But each time she ate, guilt stabbed her like a hidden blade. And yet she could not deny the humanity in the act of being fed. The cook never sneered, the guards never mocked their chewing. The food was not scraps, but the same meals American soldiers themselves consumed. That equality, however unintentional, struck deeper than she dared admit. One night, lying awake, Aiko whispered into the darkness, "Mercy is more frightening than cruelty." The words startled her even as they left her lips. For in mercy there was no defense, no armor of hatred to cling to. Mercy demanded acknowledgement, forced the prisoner to admit the enemy's humanity. That was the true weapon, more insidious than any bullet. The peanut butter and coffee became daily reminders of this paradox. Each bite was sustenance, each swallow survival. But each also carried the weight of surrender, not surrender of the body, but of certainty. If the enemy could be merciful, what else might they be? If this was not the barbarity she had been promised, then how many other promises were lies? By the end of that week, Aiko no longer cried when she ate. The tears had burned themselves out. In their place was a quiet resignation, even a fragile gratitude. She still hated herself for it, but she could not deny it. The peanut butter was sweet, the coffee was warm, and together they had dismantled walls that bombs and bayonets never could. And that was the true climax of her captivity, not the fences, not the guards, not even the showers of hot water. It was bread and butter, peanuts and coffee food, as mercy, mercy as a weapon. The unraveling of belief did not come in a single dramatic moment. It seeped in gradually like water through the cracks of stone. At first, Aiko clung desperately to her training. Never trust the enemy, resist temptation, endure humiliation. But the camp's rhythm was relentless. Every day carried the same paradox's order, without cruelty routine, without humiliation, mercy without mockery. It wore down her resolve far more effectively than any whip could have. It began with language. In one corner of the camp, American officers and civilian volunteers offered English classes. At first, the women scoffed. To learn the enemy's tongue seemed like betrayal, yet curiosity gnawed at them, and the lure of distraction from monotony drew them in. The lessons were simple words for greetings, colors, numbers, and polite expressions. Aiko sat on a wooden bench, clutching a stub of pencil, repeating haltingly, "Thank you. Please. Good morning." The sounds felt alien, heavy on her tongue, yet each phrase carved a tiny crack in the wall of hatred she had been taught. She tried once to write a short letter in English, just a few words, "I am safe." The clumsy letters looked almost childish, yet they conveyed a truth more powerful than propaganda. If she could send such words back home, would anyone believe them, or would they be dismissed as the enemy's lies? Next came books. The camp library was a modest hut lined with shelves. Most of the volumes were beyond her comprehension, but there were children's books with illustrations, magazines filled with photographs, even translations of world literature. Aiko leafed through them, fascinated by the images of cities untouched by fire, families smiling in peacetime. It was the first time she saw America not as a faceless monster, but as a place of people living lives as ordinary as her own had once been. The radio added another layer of dissonance. Every evening it crackled to life with American music. Swing bands blared brassy notes, voices crooned in English she could barely follow. The rhythms were infectious, playful, utterly unlike the grim marches she had known in Japan. Some prisoners tapped their feet unconsciously, others turned away, covering their ears as though the music itself were a form of poison. Aiko listened, heart torn. Could such joyful sounds really come from a nation of demons? Then there were the films. Once a week the guards screened newsreels in a makeshift hall. At first, Aiko refused to look convinced they would be propaganda designed to humiliate. And in truth, the films were propaganda reels showing American soldiers liberating towns in Europe, civilians cheering factories, roaring with production. Yet what unsettled her most was not the triumphalism but the glimpses of normalcy. Smiling children waving flags, women in factories welding steel beams, farmers tending vast fields. The enemy, she realized with shock, was not merely an army. They were a nation of millions, each with lives, loves, and families of their own. Inside the camp, ideological battles raged among the prisoners. Some clung fiercely to the old doctrines. "All of this is theatre," one woman insisted. "They want us to betray our emperor with gratitude." Others, weary and pragmatic, argued that survival demanded acceptance. "Better soap and bread than ashes and hunger," one said quietly. Fights broke out, verbal, sometimes physical, between those who refused to speak English and those who practiced it daily. Aiko stood in the middle, torn between shame and wonder. Every time she washed her hands with soap, she felt both clean and guilty. Every time she drank coffee, she tasted both comfort and betrayal. She could not reconcile these contradictions. The breaking point came one afternoon during a routine inspection. A guard noticed that Aiko's bar of soap had worn thin, nearly gone from use. Without a word, he handed her a new one wrapped in paper. The gesture was so casual, so unremarkable to him, yet to her it struck like a hammer. If the Americans intended cruelty, why replace the soap? Why ensure she remained healthy, clean, dignified? Standing there, clutching the new bar, Aiko felt the last threads of certainty snap. That night she whispered to herself, "If this was a lie, what else had been a lie?" The phrase echoed in her skull. She thought back to every warning she had received that Americans would starve her, torture her, humiliate her. None of it had come true. Instead, they had given her food, showers, even pencils and books. If her commanders had lied about this, what else had they lied about? Had they lied about the strength of Japan's armies, about the invincibility of the homeland, about the very purpose of the war? The realization hollowed her. She wanted to cling to the comfort of certainty, but it crumbled in her hands like ash. And in its place came an unbearable mixture of guilt and curiosity. Guilt because she had doubted the emperor and her homeland. Curiosity because she wanted to know what else lay beyond the walls of her old beliefs. Some prisoners resisted until the end, refusing to learn English, refusing to touch American books or music. But Aiko could not. She found herself humming softly to the radio's tunes, tracing English letters in her notebook, staring at the soap in her hands as though it were a key to another world. Her body was captive, but her mind had slipped the leash of propaganda. And that perhaps was the most dangerous transformation of all. When the war finally ended, it came not with a bang for Aiko, but with the hollow silence of surrender. In the camp, the prisoners were assembled and told through interpreters that Japan had capitulated after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Some women collapsed in tears, others screamed in denial. Aiko felt her knees weaken. For months she had lived in the strange paradox of captivity, fed, washed, housed by the enemy, yet always believing that her homeland would one day call her back to victory. Now that illusion was gone. What remained was only the long road back to a country she no longer recognized. The repatriation process began in late 1945. The prisoners were marched once more to ships, but this time not as captives, rather as people being returned to their nation. They carried small bundles of belongings, a blanket, a few clothes, and for Aiko, tucked deep into her bag, the last sliver of American soap she had guarded like a talisman. She stood on the deck as the coastline of Hawaii receded behind them, the palm trees shrinking into the horizon. Ahead lay Yokohama, her birthplace, her motherland, but also a land whispered to be in ruins. The voyage home was heavy with dread. Some prisoners whispered that the Americans would poison them before release, others that Japan would not welcome them back. Aiko stayed silent, clutching her bundle. She spent nights inhaling the faint scent of soap, trying to steady herself against the storm of uncertainty. When the ship docked at Yokohama, the truth revealed itself with brutal clarity. The port was shattered, warehouses, burned-out shells, cranes twisted like broken bones. The air reeked of smoke, sewage, and despair. Children with hollow eyes watched from the ruins, their clothes in tatters, their stomachs swollen from hunger. Aiko felt a cold weight in her chest as she stepped onto the soil of her homeland. Her first task was to find family. She journeyed through the streets of Tokyo, or what was left of them. Neighborhoods had been reduced to ashes by firebombing. Charred foundations marked where houses once stood. In the district where her family home had been, only fragments of a gate remained. She asked neighbors, beggars, even children in the street. News came in fragments. Her father had died years earlier in Burma. Her mother and brothers had perished during an air raid. Only a distant aunt survived, gaunt and coughing in a makeshift shelter. When Aiko embraced her, the woman weighed little more than a child. Life in post-war Japan was misery made flesh. Food was scarce, rice rationed in pitiful amounts. Soap was nearly unobtainable, traded on the black market for absurd prices. Disease spread through the slums. Aiko, once a nurse, was haunted by the memory of American clinics where she had received clean bandages, steady meals, and medicines. She dared not speak of it aloud, but in her heart the contrast screamed. In captivity she had grown healthier, stronger. Here in freedom she watched her countrymen wither. The stigma of captivity made survival even harder. Former prisoners were viewed with suspicion, as though their survival itself proved betrayal. "You must have collaborated some," whispered. "How else could you have come back alive and with flesh on your bones?" Aiko's fuller frame, the healthier glow in her skin, marked her like a scarlet letter. She felt shame stab through her whenever neighbors eyed her with thinly veiled resentment. At night she dreamt of the camp of hot water cascading from pipes of peanut butter clinging to bread of soap lathering into white foam. Waking, she would sit by a basin filled with cold water trying to scrub herself with ash, the makeshift cleanser used by civilians. The water never foamed, never smelled clean. She wept silently, remembering how she had once cursed herself for enjoying the enemy's soap. Now, in the ruins of Tokyo, that memory was both salvation and torment. Aiko carried secrets. In the hollow of her bundle she had smuggled back a tiny remnant of American soap. She dared not display it, but on nights when despair pressed hardest, she unwrapped it carefully, inhaling the faint fragrance. It reminded her of survival of humanity, of a world where even enemies had shown her mercy. And yet it also reminded her of guilt. Guilt that she had lived while her neighbors starved. Guilt that she had tasted peanut butter and coffee while children here gnawed on grass. Rather than surrender to despair, Aiko chose a path forward. She volunteered as a community nurse tending to children and the elderly in burned-out neighborhoods. She showed them how to boil water, how to scrub their hands and faces with even the smallest scraps of soap. When there was no soap, she improvised, teaching them to use ash and sand more effectively. In her heart, she carried the conviction that cleanliness, simple as it seemed, could save lives. It was the lesson the Americans had taught her one. She now passed on quietly without ever naming its source. Her memories of captivity became a private paradox, both a wound and a lifeline. She could never confess to her aunt, to her neighbors, that she had once found dignity within American fences. She could never tell them of the hot showers that melted away weeks of grime or of the taste of peanut butter that brought her to tears. To speak of it would invite scorn, perhaps violence, yet she carried those memories like contraband in her soul, invisible but indestructible. Years later, long after Japan had begun to rebuild, Aiko would still pause when she smelled soap or coffee. These scents became for her a kind of time machine, transporting her back to the camp, to the mess hall, to the paradox of mercy in war. She came to believe that survival itself was not shameful but a duty, though she never fully erased the sting of guilt. Her story was not unique. Many former prisoners lived with the same silence, the same burden of knowing that sometimes captivity had offered more nourishment, more dignity than freedom. But for Aiko, the memories of soap and showers of food and warmth were not simply comforts. They were proof that humanity could bloom even in the darkest of wars. And though she never dared say it aloud, she carried a secret, enduring truth. She had not survived because of cruelty, but because of kindness. In the end, Aiko's story was not one of triumph or defeat, but of contradiction. She entered captivity, expecting humiliation, pain, and the stripping away of all dignity. Instead, she was met with something far more disarming: hot showers, bars of soap bread with peanut butter steaming coffee. Ordinary things, yet in the context of war, they became extraordinary symbols. The irony was bitter. She had braced herself for the lash of cruelty, yet it was mercy that broke her certainty. Each act of care, each clean sheet, each bar of soap, each full meal eroded the walls of propaganda more effectively than any weapon could. Food became not just sustenance but a message. Soap was not just for washing, but for reminding her that she was still human. These were tools of power no less potent than bombs, but wielded with quiet, devastating grace. Years later, as Japan rebuilt, Aiko never forgot the paradox. She knew that kindness could be as destabilizing as violence, that mercy itself was a kind of soft power. She carried the memory like a question that refused to fade. If such mercy could exist even in the heart of war, then what else had been possible all along? It was not the barbed wire or the guards that lingered in her memory, but the scent of soap and the warmth of coffee reminders that even amid destruction, humanity had not been extinguished.